just appalling. How is that going to end up? It's a lunacy method. But I do think people are questioning, but they're afraid, and they've lost their barometers. The norms that used to be there, like of war and peace and dialogue and multilateralism, are gone now. You have to join a gang. You have to choose a side. People don't like that. They feel uncomfortable by it, but there's a huge amount of bullying behind the scenes to force them to like that. So the Union yesterday were saying, yes, the sanctions are hurting the people of Europe, but they're hurting Russia more. State sponsor of terrorism is a term of US law. It doesn't exist in EU law. But a Zelensky advisor called for it in the Parliament magazine, and here we are again reporting for duty. And all it will do is make peace harder to achieve. Exactly, of course, what the extremists want. No peace, no off-ramps, all bridges burning, and Ukraine a permanent abattoir in a suicidal holy crusade against Russia. So, if you want to start naming state sponsors of terrorism, let's do it. European sponsorship of Israeli terrorism in Palestine, Western sponsorship of Saudi terror in Yemen, ISIS, the product of French, American, British, Turkish and Gulf sponsorship in Syria and Iraq. Decades of right-wing US-backed terrorism against the Cuban Revolution, the Contras in Nicaragua, death squads in Guatemala, in El Salvador. Remember Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, horror after horror, terror after terror. There's nothing constructive about the pot calling the kettle black. Would you ever cop on, start championing peace and end the war, which is patently in the interests of EU, Ukrainian and Russian citizens?
Hello and welcome. This is a very special show as we have with us the ever outspoken Clare Daly. Clare is an Irish politician who has been a member of the European Parliament from Ireland since July 2019. She is a member of Independence for Change, part of the left in the European Parliament. Since becoming a member of the European Parliament, Clare has gained international attention for her radical advocacy for peace and justice. Clare, welcome to Indian Global Left.
Thanks a million for inviting me on. An absolute honor. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I wanted to begin with this, on a lighter note. What did your fellow parliamentarians tell you right after you delivered that historic speech in European Parliament on state sponsor of terrorism? I mean, did they say you, well done? Did they tell you, did they push back, or did they just avoid?
Probably to sort of go back to Russia, which is a bit difficult considering I was never there in the first place, so I can't really go back. We did a little bit of Moscow calling and, yeah, basically, giving out and, tutting and shouting, and yeah, that was basically it. But yeah, that was the extent of it. But hardly surprising when you think that myself and my colleague Mick Wallace tabled a motion during that debate where we argued for the Parliament to use, or the European Union to use its power to campaign for an immediate cessation of hostilities and a peaceful and diplomatic resolution of the conflict. And the actual outcome of that vote was 450 MEPs voted against it, and about 130 voted for it, and the rest abstained. So can you actually, on a motion calling for peace and diplomacy, that's a very accurate summary of the horrific scale of the disconnect that exists between the European Parliament and the majority of citizens across Europe and indeed the world. It's mental.
Absolutely. We'll come back to that, but before that, if we may ask you, what does it mean to be a left party in Ireland? I mean, it is one of the richest places on earth. So can you just tell us a little bit about your party and the kind of issues that you pick up in Ireland, the local and the national politics?
Well, I suppose there's a couple of things. I mean, Ireland is nominally a wealthy country, and of course we are, but obviously the divide between those who have and those who have not is growing, as indeed it's growing in every place around the world. And a lot of our wealth is based on the decision of our governments to basically prostitute Ireland as a tax haven, and a lot of the multinationals are located there, big tech multinationals, US multinationals, there to exploit that situation and our educated workforce. So I think Ireland's an interesting country because we're a country that's very much embedded in Western Europe, very pro-US, but actually we are a former colonized country, 800 years of British colonialism, and that has defined us. So we're the only nation, if you like, in Western Europe that has been colonized, yet we're friendly towards. We could, as a neutral country, play an outstanding role on the world stage, if you like, as independent brokers who will go and talk to anybody. And actually, it was that history of peacekeeping, which we're famous for, which was what Ireland marketed itself on to become and win the position on the UN Security Council. And yet when we're on it, as we are, war breaks out in Europe. And what does neutral Ireland do? Not only does it not support initiatives for peace, it's actually voted against them when others have tabled those at UN level. Now, that is absolutely disgusting. So there's always been a strong left in Ireland because of our colonial past, but because of the national question, it's had, I suppose, it's been, how would you say it, I suppose, defined by the national question as well. So you have Sinn Féin, if you like, who are not really left-wing. They certainly position themselves now as left-wing. Their voters are very left-wing. Some of their members are very left-wing. But actually, I think we'll find that they are a radical nationalist party, and they will be tested when they come to power. And, you know, we have the opportunity now, probably in the next election, where they will come into government for the first time in the history of the state. We'll have a government that hasn't been made up of one of the two big right-wing parties who've predominantly ruled Ireland. So that's a really good thing, and I hope that Sinn Féin do come into power, but we'll see. The radical left, the rest of it then is there's a Trotskyist left organised around people before profit. There's that awful, wouldn't even call them left, Labour Party, horrible social democratic types. We're actually, myself and my colleague, we're actually independents. So even though we're called Independents for Change and it is a registered group, that was really only from the point of view of getting resources in the Irish Parliament. It's not really a party as such. So we very much see ourselves as independents. We worked with other independents in the Irish Parliament under that umbrella group. So we kind of march together but separately, and we think we are strengthened by our ability to say and do what we like and answer to our own agenda, that it gives us a freedom, if you like, to express ourselves very well. Now, independent candidates is something that is kind of uniquely Irish anyway. It's a tradition that we have. There'll always be a load of independents getting elected. People in Ireland tend to vote for the individual as much as they do for the party. And I suppose what the person embodies is symptomatic of the party maybe, but they're voting for the person. So, you know, I suppose I'm not really best qualified to talk about the state of the left in Ireland now, because since being elected to the Irish Parliament, I'm based in Brussels, so I'm more rooted here. But I suppose the left is like the left everywhere. It's a bit fragmented in Ireland. They don't cooperate enough. Sometimes they were able to be brought together in a powerful movement in the Right to Water campaign a number of years ago when I was in the Parliament, where you had the coming together of left groups in the Parliament and beyond, the communities at grassroots levels and the trade unions. And it was the role of the trade unions kind of discipline the political groups. So that was a nice kind of grouping of three parts, which worked really effectively and stopped the privatisation of water and stopped the charging of water at that time. It was quite radical, but other than that, you have the usual infighting and all the rest. But I mean, historically, we've never really had, well, we've never had a left government, as I say, in part because of the national question, but we've always kind of returned radical voices to Europe. Ireland has always been Euro-critical. It's not that we're not, we're very pro-European. People say, are you pro-Europe? And I said, well, I'm an internationalist. I'm pro, I want good relations with everybody around the world. I don't think that should just stop at Europe, but opposed to the manner in which the EU is organised as a structure. So, I mean, look, at the left is as it is everywhere, I suppose. But yeah, there's.
Interesting. You have said that you have never had a left in Ireland for the national question. I'm sure you are not counting the Labour Party within the left, but I mean, is there even a small section within the Labour Party in Ireland which can be called as a radical left, or is it fully co-opted into the extreme centre?
In the Labour Party is an absolute and utter appalling betrayal of the origins of James Connolly's party, and have been for many, many years now. I mean, they have repeatedly gone into government as the small partner and carried out the most vicious austerity measures and gone against the interests of the working class, and have been brutally punished, and appropriately so, for that. So now in opposition, people don't take them seriously, and actually they would be really eliminated, other than the fact that a section of the established media tend to try and keep them alive. So they get an enormous amount of coverage from the state broadcaster RTE, from the Irish Times, the so-called paper of repute, which is just a basic neoliberal rag. But they constantly feature the Labour Party in a manner in which keeps them alive. But they will have a handful of people elected, no more. And there isn't a radical bone in the body of any of them. Would they go in as a partner in government with Sinn Féin? Yes, they probably would, if there was some crumbs in it. But if they do, they'll be a tiny part of the outfit and insignificant largely.
Very depressing. I wanted to come to the sentiment on ground in Europe regarding the war in Ukraine in specific, and the role of NATO in the region in general. I mean, we get a divided picture from the news. We hear of anti-war protests in places like Paris. We hear cautious statements from officials in Germany, and we hear of very radical advocacy for peace from people like you in the European Parliament on one hand, and then on the other hand, I mean, total sort of rebel-rousing, pro-NATO switch of countries like Sweden and Finland by breaking their neutrality. So it's a very divided picture that we get. Can you give us a sense of sentiments on ground regarding the war in Ukraine in specific and the NATO's role in the region in general?
I think anybody looking on from outside of Europe, and actually a load of people inside of Europe, are just absolutely scratching their head and going, what in God's name is Europe doing? I mean, they're shooting themselves in 2 feet. Their economies are spiraling into disaster. Their citizens are facing a winter where many will have to choose between heating or eating. This has all been done supposedly to help the war effort, yet the war is going on and on. More and more Ukrainians are dying and being displaced. It's just lunacy. It's absolutely lunacy. And we were traveling last week in Pakistan, and actually a number of people said it's sad. It's so sad to see how Europe has crumbled in this way. And it is. And loads of people in Europe are saying exactly the type of thing, because you would think, even in the interests of capitalism, that European capitalists would be saying, hang on a minute here now, we're not going down this lunacy. But the truth is that in the early stages of the war, sections of European capitalism did try and do that, but they were ruthlessly silenced and castigated. So that the narrative now across Europe, and it still prevails, the dominant reportage of the war and the manner in which it's dealt with, is that anybody who deviates at all from the narrative that this war must keep going until Russia is defeated is a Russian stooge, is anti-Ukrainian, and is a total disgrace. And that's basically still the main narrative. Now, it is beginning to shift a bit. It definitely is. I think as the cold is biting, as the economic situation is getting worse, people are going, hang on a minute now. So, I mean, we faced enormous abuse. Like, the establishment in Ireland seized on our anti-war stance to get revenge, to try and eliminate that Euro-critical voice from Europe. They thought they had their chance now to crush us. by associating us with sort of being anti-Ukrainian, which is obviously patently nonsense, and so on. So it's beginning to change, and the voices for peace are being heard more. As you say, demonstrations are taking place in many European cities, and they're getting peace, but not all. In most European cities, there haven't been any demonstrations at all, and there still isn't. So people are still afraid to raise their head and question what's going on, but they are questioning more. And I mean, we're getting emails morning, noon and night from people from every country, and it's been interesting. In the early days, with the biggest countries like the likes of Italy, there's a huge anti-NATO tradition in Italy, so always loads of people in Italy get into it. Germany as well, the same thing, huge anti-military sentiment because of their history. Really surprising for me, we've had an awful lot of Swedes getting in touch, which I was very surprised about. They were kind of third on the list of people getting in touch on a regular basis, but really right across the world, people are sort of saying, what is going on? It's not even that people are sort of arguing for peace, they're kind of shaking their heads and going, what is going on here? Like, where is the world going? That we're living now in a world, we're supposed to be a democracy. The EU says, oh, fighting authoritarianism. But you can't have a dissenting view, or you're immediately castigated or demonized or put on some Ukrainian hit list that you could potentially get assassinated on, like, and nobody says anything. That's kind of fair game. It's bizarre, the direction. And to me, I think, how did this happen? I think it's happened because of the influence of US-led think tanks and funding of media across Europe and indeed the world, that they are on message now. Once the war started, this is clearly a proxy NATO-US war. They see Putin's appalling move to invade Ukraine as all their Christmas is coming together. It's their chance now to destabilize Russia, undermine them. Even in the European Union yesterday, we're saying, yes, well, yes, the sanctions are hurting the people of Europe, but they're hurting Russia more. I mean, for God's sake, and that's the jury's even out on that. I wouldn't even say they are, to be honest. But I mean, even if they were, is that a good enough reason? Like, it's just appalling. How is that going to end up? It's a lunacy method. But I do think people are questioning, but they're afraid, and they've lost their barometers. The norms that used to be there, like of war and peace and dialogue and multilateralism, are gone now. You have to join a gang. You have to choose a side. People don't like that. They feel uncomfortable by it, but there's a huge amount of bullying behind the scenes to force them to like that. So I'd say the predominant mood is people are confused. They're very upset at what's gone on. They're very worried for their future, but they don't really know how to find a way out of that. That's why I think it's so good that the protests have begun to take place, because that can only then embolden people. It's what's badly needed and what has been missing from the occasion to, put manners on the politicians. You need the people to take action. So it's great that they finally are. And maybe, who knows, with a cold winter ahead, with the austerity measures going to bite ever worse and with no end to the war in sight, maybe sense will prevail to that sense. But I would say the mood is pretty, cowed at the moment in Europe.
You mentioned about the Western sanction and the media's sort of support for it. I was reading this foreign affairs journal in the United States, two leading sort of thinkers of foreign policy, Fiona Hill and Angela Stent. They wrote a long piece about the war. So they began by giving us a sense of imaginary empire presided by President Putin. And then they began to sort of rebuke the global South, saying that, oh, the global South doesn't understand that the Putin has broken international law and they are busy with petty things like fuel, fertilizer, and food. So there is no hope from the global South. Then they go on to say that the only hope is the NATO and Europe. So Europe should do everything it can to drive the sanctions, and meanwhile, NATO should sort of defeat the Russians. And as an evidence, they say that the breaking of neutrality by countries like Sweden and Finland vindicates our point. I mean, that's the kind of lunacy that is going on. But I was interested in hearing from you about, is there any fear about the nuclear escalation in Europe? Because we have a long history of anti-nuclear war movement in the 70s and beginning of 80s in Europe. Is that an issue there at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of things on that, and your point about their point about the sanctions and this absolute disgusting arrogance about the global south just don't understand. Of course, they say the same, that ordinary people in Europe, they don't understand. They're the victims of Russian propaganda when they're giving out about fuel prices, and they say that it's the sanctions. How dare they? You know, oh my God, they're Putin puppets. You know, it's just this is what goes on all the time. You know, and when I went, I said, sorry, excuse me, global south here, do you not think that it's actually not got to do with the fact that they're the victims of Russian propaganda, but actually a lot of those countries have been at the receiving end of interventionism from the US and NATO? This isn't the only war there's ever been. It's not that they agree with the war or anything like that, but they don't agree that escalating it is the answer either. And I mean, it's been really difficult for other states to hold their neutral line. I mean, we know that the US went around bullying countries at the UN General Assembly, trying to get them not to abstain or vote against the motion. And a whole number of countries did buckle under that pressure recently, which is absolutely reprehensible, because it's absolutely correct for those countries to abstain. They've made it clear their opposition to the war. It's in breach of the UN Charter. As we've said, we utterly condemn it. But the idea now that the US and NATO involvement in this is some sort of protector of democracy is just a sick joke. And we've had a lot around that. And within that, the role of the potential of a nuclear catastrophe has been dangerously ignored, I would say. So it's talked about. Sometimes it's talked about as, you know, fake news. Oh, you're just saying that now just to sort of thing. That's a very foolish thing to do when nuclear weapons are at play. Now, we've seen some elements sort of trying to rein it in and say, hang on here, this is a particular problem here. But when you think about it, the strategy supposedly of the US, NATO, supported by the EU, is that this war is being done to defeat Russia. Okay, so if there was ever a possibility of that happening, Russia are clearly going to go for the nuclear option. So it was just an absolute catastrophe. So that as a goal in and of itself is a ridiculous goal which can never be fulfilled. So they're completely wrong in that. And what they're doing is they're expecting the ordinary working class young fellas in Ukraine to be cannon fodder for their desire to wound Russia, and indeed Russian young men to be cannon fodder on the other side for this war to get on. And the interesting thing is that the billions of euros being spent by the US in continuing this war for Ukraine, none of it is ending up in Ukraine. Most of it is staying in the US, going as a present to the US arms companies. Weapons which are then flooding Ukraine, some of which nobody knows where they are, some of which they do know are appearing for sale on the dark web. It's been absolutely verified by Finnish intelligence, at a Europol meeting I was at as well, that these arms are getting into the hands of criminals as well. So no doubt there'll be blowback from that as well. It's utter lunacy that you would flood an area with arms in a way, but there's no end to it. So nuclear war, I mean, do I think it's likely? No. Do I think it's possible? Yes, it's always possible. And the problem is that once a war starts, it can always escalate. It's not that I think anybody will ever plan it, but you never know. You are playing with fire when it gets to this, and that is such an incredibly dangerous position, which I don't think the international community has taken seriously enough, because I think they see that then as giving some sort of a distorted advantage to Russia and whatever else. We cannot do that, which is just, it's sick. It's actually sick. And this is the new world order now. It's all about gangs, and you're in our gang or you're not. And that's what they're doing in the global south as well. And there's no doubt about it that once they finish with this, or even while it's going on, it's been so successful for them in using Ukraine to batter Russia, I mean, we remember that Hillary Clinton said this can be Russia's Afghanistan. And look at poor Afghanistan now. My God, the situation those people are in. But that is what's going to happen to Ukraine as this war. And it's been so successful, destabilizing and interfering in Ukraine back to 2014 and so on. They're going to do the same in Taiwan. And they're moving on to China next. And they're ratcheting it up there now in the South China Sea, and we've more military expenditure, and we're hyping up all the tension, and we're getting another gang in here, and we're trying to woo India this way and put all the others in the other gang. It's pathetic, and the only winners are the military industrial complex.
Absolutely. I mean, the decades of one China policy that has worked to some extent has been now broken, and the Taiwan Strait has been totally destabilized, and there's a recently massive escalation in the Korean Peninsula, and this is coming as we see hawkish opinion in the not in North America, including people like Prime Minister Trudeau calling for direct intervention in Haiti. I mean, that's sort of lunacy. And on the nuclear escalation, I mean, the kind of drills that went on in Brazil for a week, and then, you know, Russia responded by its own nuclear drill. It's a dangerous game that is going on, and it's spreading all over. I mean, they're sending nuclear bombers to places like all over the Indo-Pacific region. So it's
yeah, and I think there's been kind of a sort of a reinterpretation of language, and there's no knowledge of what nuclear arms actually are. Like, when it's talked about in the media, it's done in a very benign way, like, they might, or should they use a bit, and sure, that's grand, and then we'll all get up tomorrow and we'll use something else, as if it's like just some other normal type of warfare. And I find the media are hugely responsible in that. So a lot of young people actually who weren't involved in those big anti-nuclear movements and don't come from that history have no idea what nuclear means. They're used to, you know, computer games and all that kind of thing. They don't really see it as dramatically different, which of course it is. And as you say, when you're playing with fire like that, any accidents or anything can happen. It's incredibly dangerous.
I was struck by your important point that the global South isn't very concerned because they are dreaded by the horrors of American imperialism, you know, of 70 years. In fact, that Foreign Affairs article that I was referring to, they rebuked the global South by saying, oh, they don't understand that our intervention in Vietnam was for, you know, democracy and on moral grounds, and they are still thinking that Russia is like the Soviet Union who fought for their national liberation, but it is not, and so on. So they are teaching the global South lessons, but that is sort of part of a long history of colonial mentality, where, you know, lecturing the global South about what to do has been
well, I mean, it's absolutely unbelievable. I mean, the US has 800 bases all over the world. Their environmental footprint alone, not to mind all the other damage that they do, is absolutely catastrophic, and they're still in that place. I mean, I don't know if it got much coverage in India, but the so-called High Representative of the European Union, he's like our Foreign Minister Joseph Borrell, actually described the rest of the world and the global South as a jungle, and the European Union as a garden, and that the jungle could invade the garden, and that a wall wasn't enough, that we had to develop other means. And he didn't even get sacked for that, like literally using old colonial language. Now, for starters, the European Union isn't a garden. A fifth of the population here living in poverty. It has a lot of its own as well. But to call the rest of the world a jungle that's going to invade this garden is just sick. It is a colonial mindset, and that's what they're at. Like, they've never involve themselves in other countries for humanitarian, egalitarian reasons. It's all to fuel their own economic interests. Europe got fat and developed off the blood and assets of the global South, and they're still at it in a different way. It's just called neoliberalism. Now they call it human rights, and they go down and interfere. And most of these countries, they might have had problems, but they didn't have near as many problems as they have now. We see that now in Africa, in the likes of Mali and so on. We obviously see it in so many other countries as well. Look at the state of Afghanistan now, of Iraq, of all of these countries, Iran. You know, they go on about women's rights and rights now. Women had loads of rights and went around as normal 40, 50 in those countries before the West ever got involved and fueled extremism and so on. So that's what they brought. They didn't bring so-called democracy. They brought extremism, they brought chaos, and they brought very nice profits for their own arms manufacturers. But what I'm really heartened by is, and we get a huge response actually from people in the global south, loads of people from Africa get in touch. You know, we were in Pakistan and people stopped us in the airport going, oh, I know you, kind of thing. It's incredible, couldn't believe it. That the level of education and engagement and the young population in these countries is actually what gives me hope, because I seriously think that Europe and the US is in a hugely difficult place for the labour movement, for activists, for young people. It's very, very difficult. And for me, the hope for humanity actually comes out of the global south, that the global south, which contains the majority of the world's population, that community needs to assert its voice in a sort of a non-aligned way to say, we want to live in a multipolar world. We don't want camps. We're not joining your gang. We want to work with everybody and be friends with everybody, you know, because it's only ordinary people who suffer when you don't do that. And I think out of, you know, the non-aligned countries, hopefully some movement could come. It's really good that it was Mexico that led. Well, it's really disgraceful that it wasn't Ireland that made the call for peace at the UN Security Council, but fair play to Mexico who were a former colonized country and, like Ireland, neutral as well. Unfortunately, Ireland is only neutral in name now. Its behaviour has been scandalous, but that's another story.
Right. You referred to Afghanistan and the status of women. I mean, prior to the late 70s, before the US-led jihadi war following the Russian invasion, and it wasn't a feminist utopia, but the status of women was much better. I mean, it was with the sort of, export of the US-backed jihadi terror that the status of women declined. I mean, people like Gulbuddin Hekmatyar would throw acid on Kabul University, and that's where it began from. But I don't want to let you go before asking one final question, if you have the time.
Sure, yeah.
Okay, so I mean, I was reading the news today, this morning, and I read that 250 asylum seekers were stranded off the coast of Italy, and the humanitarian ship wasn't allowed to disembark. And you have been speaking out against restrictive immigration policy following, the COVID and so on. I was listening to your one of your talks, and we have been seeing this for quite some times. The Brexit and the dramatic collapse of the Corbynite Labour Party on the single issue of immigration. The recent Swedish election, where anti-immigration sentiment was a big deal. So, and then even countries like Greece, I mean, they are doing horrendous stuff off their coast. Can you tell us a little bit about this anti-immigration or restrictive immigration sentiment in
yeah, I think
Europe?
I suppose one of the reasons why the boat not being allowed to dock has got news is that in many ways Frontex, the European Coast Guard, has been, I suppose, successful, and I use that word in all the wrong context, in keeping boats from getting anywhere near landing before. So Europe's border management strategy has been to keep migrants away from its borders as much as it possibly can. And Frontex, the Coast Guard, funded by EU taxpayers' money, it's the biggest agency, a multi-billion euro agency now that gets EU money, has been found to be complicit in human rights violations off the coast of Greece, of pushing people back, denying them the right to seek asylum in Greece, and basically having people drown. I've been to Greece myself, where I've attended the trial of Afghani young men who were stranded on boats left by smugglers. They took the help to save people on the boats, and then because of Greek law, they were criminalized and imprisoned for people smuggling, because they basically saved the boat, because they've been involved in people trafficking, allegedly horrific stuff, when they themselves were migrants. That's an everyday occurrence. We've had situations on the border with Croatia of EU equipment being used, people being beaten, migrants being stripped of their clothes, their phones stolen, and made to walk through forests. We've had people die on the borders with Poland at the same time as they're opening the borders and whisking in millions of Ukrainians, many of them from parts of Ukraine that there isn't even a war in. Afghan families were dying in the same forests, and some of the people who tried to help rescue them were criminalized. I mean, it's just a sickening racist migration policy, completely and utterly illegal in terms of international law. The European Union's Frontex has been caught out. The European Commission has been caught out for knowing full well what's gone on, and there's been really no recriminations. The head of Frontex had to resign, but that's about it. They have a new migration pact which they're discussing, but really it is a kind of a racist pact, and it's all rooted in keeping migrants out. And that's why you have the outsourcing of it to Turkey, paying Turkey billions of euros every year to basically keep people in cages, which the Erdogan government then sometimes decide to release the cages to the gates of Europe, to frighten Europe, to get a few more bob out of them or whatever. So migrants are being weaponed. And then, of course, Libya, which is nearly an unspeakable horror. People being sent back to areas where there's open slavery, rape, torture. So that's your European Union of values. So we're the ones bringing values to the global south. I'd be very scared now if I was in the global south then based on that, because they're just total hypocrisy in terms of what's gone on there. It is a two-tier racist policy. They're not even complying with international law, and it is only getting worse. So you have rhetoric on the one hand and the actual situation on the other. It's barbarism. And as we speak now, and partly in a consequence to the Ukraine war, there are refugees on the streets of Brussels now, and every night Afghan men routinely will not get accommodation here. A couple of weeks ago, for the first time, they were putting minors out on the streets. Never happened before. So young children from Afghanistan, maybe 14, 15-year-old young people, were having to sleep on the streets. And the Red Cross here shut down its operations, will only deal with Ukrainians. How? Yeah.
There were talks about restricting Russian immigration into Europe. What's going on that front? Is there any policy?
Well, that is yeah, I mean, what they did in the end, like Russia had a kind of a favorable visa arrangement. There wasn't visa-free travel, but there was it was easier for a Russian to get a visa maybe than for somebody else, I don't know, right? But so they've removed that privilege, which was just collective punishment and completely against international law. Okay, they didn't stop Russians can still apply for visas. Some lunatic EU member states have prevented them from doing so. The Baltic states are incredibly anti-Russian. They don't do that, but most EU member states, Russians can apply for visas. Obviously, there are millions of Russians living in Europe, millions of Russians married to Europeans who have grannies and granddads and want to go and visit and all this. It's absolutely ridiculous, the idea that you could say they wouldn't be allowed to travel. Plus, there are probably many conscientious objectors who don't want to fight in the war in Russia. We're going to lock them in and not allow them out either. So, but what's really sickening is that at the same time as they were talking about this in Russia, and the official reason is that, well, the reason for that is that because Russia is involved in a horrific illegal war and it's an authoritarian regime. Okay, well, so what are they doing? And what meeting was I at today? Well, it's to give a visa-free arrangement to Qatar and Kuwait. Now, of course, Qatar is involved in an illegal war in Yemen and is an authoritarian state, way worse than Russia by all means, but that doesn't matter. Because sure, it's only Yemenis who are dying there. No one obviously cares about that, clearly, because the European Parliament never talks about it anyway, that's for sure. But how disgusting that on the eve of the World Cup, when drenched in the blood of migrant workers to build those stadiums in Qatar, Qatar involved in a filthy war in Yemen, and the European Union is going to give visa-free travel to Qatar and Kuwait, and they're quite open about it because we need their fossil fuels. So they don't want to be reliant on Russian gas because Russia is authoritarian, but they'll take it from Qatar because they are not, and they'll take it from the United States in filthy LNG frack gas. Meanwhile, the planet is burning, and people in the global south, in the likes of Pakistan and so on, are the ones facing the ramifications of climate change. It's crazy. So I think that in and of itself gives you an indication of how disreputable the European Union has become.
Right. Pakistan had one of the worst floods in its recent history. Thousands of people literally died. We can only hope that someday what was promised to Gorbachev, a common Eurasian homeland based on common economic and strategic interest between Eurasia, Russia, and Europe, someday would reach there. But Clare Daly, thank you very much.